Hi everyone, and welcome to day 11 of our bedtime stories. My name is Julie Hartley, and I'm one of the directors at Centauri Summer Arts Camp, Centauri Arts Retreat, the Arts Academy in Toronto, and our online writing workshops. Thank you very much for joining us. And tonight's story is called The Boy Who Spoke to Birds, and it's a Scottish folk tale. So please get yourselves comfortable, grab your favorite drink, your pillow, and try to imagine as you close your eyes and listen to this story that you're in a room filled with people, because if you're tuning in at 8:30 tonight, then you will actually be listening to this alongside quite a few other people. That's what we do at camp every year. We tell stories in our theatre with the theatre lights on low and pastel colours and music playing. And everybody just lying in their own space in a comfortable spot on the floor with their blanket or their pillow and closing their eyes, and all of us imagining the same things at the same time, because that's what people have done with stories for thousands of years. It's what I love about storytelling. And I am telling this story. I'm not reading it. I don't really even have any notes beside me. So please forgive any mistakes along the way. And I just want to say that I've had quite a lot of people emailing me to ask why I'm not doing these live at 8:30 p.m. That's a little scary. So I'm actually just going to do that with the final story, which will be number 14 on Sunday night. Will not be recorded and will not be placed up any earlier than 8:30. It will be done live 8:30 on Sunday evening. So without further ado, let's get started. This is called The Boy Who Spoke to Birds, and I hope you enjoy. Once upon a time, a long, long time ago, there was a strong and fearless chieftain in Scotland who spent his entire life fighting his enemies, swinging his sword in battle year after year until he was strong and battle-hardened and convinced beyond all else that the only thing you needed in life was to be strong. And this chieftain had been so busy fighting his enemies and building his kingdom that he was quite old by the time he got married, and he and his wife had a baby son. And just before the baby was born, he started to fret. He said, "I'm an old man now. How can I possibly teach this boy to be strong? And yet I know that strength above all else is what matters. By the time he reaches adulthood and I could teach him everything I knew, it'll be too late." And his wife listened to his fretting and tried to figure out what she could do to make him happy. And she knew of an old wise woman who lived within the forest. And she knew that this woman was supposedly able to cast spells. Everyone referred to her as a witch. And so one day, when she was 9 months pregnant, the chieftain's wife went to see this old woman in the forest. And she said, "My husband is powerful and strong, and he wishes that his son be the same, because he may not be around to teach him those qualities as he grows." And the old woman said, "I can give you a spell. I can tell you what to do. And all I can tell you is that what I give you will be what this child needs to become what he must be." Well, her words seemed very cryptic. It wasn't like she was saying, "I can give you a spell that will make this child strong." But the chieftain's wife decided this was the best she had. And so she said, "Okay, I agree. Give me what you can, and that will be good enough." And the witch said, "When the baby is born, his first sip of milk should be taken from the skull of a raven. Do this, and this child will develop something that he may require to become what he needs to be." Again, cryptic words, but the chieftain's wife hurried home, and she found a dead raven, and she had its skull cleaned ready. And a few days later, she gave birth to a baby boy, and she and the chieftain named him Seamus. And when the baby boy was ready to take his first sip of milk, she held out to him a raven's skull with the milk inside, and dripped the milk onto his lips from inside the skull. "This is nonsense," said the chieftain. It's just wicked magic." But he still had no other ideas about how he might make his son strong if he was not around to make him so, and therefore he humoured his wife. And Seamus grew. He grew for 5 years, and in the first 5 years of his life his father saw nothing to celebrate, for he seemed like a sickly infant. He seemed smaller than the others, and weaker, and less inclined to wield a sword even in play, and this bothered the father. And 5 more years grew, and this was a child who would much rather make up stories and sing songs and sit thinking by the fire than take to the wooden swords he was given, or practice swordsmanship, or fight with other boys in the courtyard. And this worried the chieftain even more. And one day he came upon his son in the courtyard, and Seamus was sitting under a tree, and the tree was filled with every kind of bird imaginable. The tree was filled with ravens and crows and sparrows and goldfinches and every kind of bird that he'd ever seen before. And as he watched his son, the boy lifted his head to the trees and made a strange noise that the chieftain had never heard come from a human mouth before. And instantly a dozen birds responded with songs of their own. The chieftain rushed forward and seized his son. He said, "What are you doing?" The boy said, "I'm talking to the birds. They are teaching me things." Well, the chieftain fell into a rage, and he called his wife and he said, "So this is what the mad old woman gave my son. Not strength as I'd asked for, but the ability to talk with birds? What use is such a skill in my world?" And his wife was silent, for she didn't know the answer to that question, and all she knew was that her son could do something no one else could do, and deep down, that made her happy. Well, more years went by, and the father scorned his son, because as Seamus grew to be a young adult, he still showed no interest in being strong, in wielding a sword, in being great in battle, and the chieftain was afraid for his kingdom and ashamed of his son. And one day, Seamus was serving his father in the great hall, as it was the tradition that sons should do. And there was a great clamouring in the fireplace up in the chimney. And the chieftain turned to his son and said, "So, if you're as clever as you think you are, tell me what those birds are saying right now." And Seamus said, "Father, I cannot. For if I tell you what those birds are saying, you would be really mad." Well, this made the chieftain furious, and he said, "I'm commanding you. I don't care how mad you think it'll make me. I want to know what those birds are saying." So Seamus said, "Father, the birds are speaking a prophecy. They are saying that today I serve you at the table, but there will come a day when I sit where you are now and you serve me." Well, the chieftain went suddenly quiet, which was a sign to everyone around him that he was no longer just mildly angry and frustrated, but furious. Seamus left his father and went to his chambers, and all night long his mother watched the chieftain and watched the anger grow. "It means something terrible," he told his wife. "What these birds have said, they mean that one day my son will become powerful, but he will not become powerful in the way I have and grow our kingdom for our family. He will grow powerful and he will unseat me, and he will become chieftain in my place and make of me nothing but a slave." And he grew angry and angrier and angrier, until at dawn he seized a dagger. And his wife realized that what would come to pass would result in the death of her only son. And she rushed to Seamus's bedchamber, and she dragged him out of bed, and she said, "There is no time to get dressed. There is no time to grab anything. You must just flee from this palace, because your father is going to kill you." And Seamus rushed from the palace. He rushed out into the hills and out into the surrounding moorland, and using small pathways known only by animals, he ran all through that day. And as he ran for his life, a cloud of birds formed above his head, every kind of bird imaginable, and they told him where to go to avoid the soldiers that pursued him. And that night he took his rest in a cave, and there thought about events that had happened. And while he rested, owls flew down to him from the trees, and they gave him messages about how he should be wise and how he could survive on his own in the middle of the highlands. And when the next day came, the daybirds showed him where to find food, and they also taught him the ways of wilderness and how he might survive. And for days he wandered aimlessly, until an eagle descended beside him and said, "Run, the soldiers are getting closer. Your father is still hot on your heels." And so Seamus moved out of Scotland and into England, first to the north of England, and then, when the birds spoke to him again, further and further south, until at last he came to the southern coast of England, and there he rested and listened again to the wisdom whispered to him by the birds by day and night, and the advice of the birds on what he should do next. And again there came a day when an eagle descended and said, "The soldiers have now reached England. They are making their way south. They will find you. You must take a boat to mainland Europe." And so Seamus took a boat, and he sailed to mainland Europe, to Normandy, and there, still followed by the birds that loved and protected him, he wandered aimlessly until the same message came again. "Your father's soldiers have crossed to the continent. They are still hot on your trail." And so he went east, where the forest was impenetrable. He went east into Transylvania, now a part of modern-day Romania, and through the thick forest he wandered day after day, now resembling nothing short of a beggar. But the birds came with him, they protected him, and again they taught him everything he knew. They knew, and more days went by, and at last an eagle descended in front of Seamus and said, "Your father's soldiers have given up. They have gone home, and you are safe." Now what should he do? Seamus was worried. What would his future hold away from his family, his friend, and his country? The next day he wandered further into Transylvania, and it took him a few hours to realize that something had changed. There were no birds in the trees. There were no sounds. There were no wings flapping through the sky. There was nothing. And he grew more and more worried as the day went on. A sense of dread gripped him. What had happened to the birds that had come with him all this way? What had happened to the birds that should be there anyway, in a forest as dense and as wild as this? Until the next day at noon, he had his answer. The trees ended, and where there should have been more forest stretching as far as the eye could see, there was a desolate wasteland, everything chopped down, everything destroyed. And in horror, he wandered through the wasteland until he came to a wide flowing river, and saw on the river a bunch of thieves who had chopped down all the trees and were now sailing the logs along the river to sell them in a market downstream. Well, Seamus was horrified, for where there should have been wildness beyond compare in this thick and wonderful forest, there was only a wasteland, and these people had made it so. He continued on through the desolate wasteland where once there had been trees, and heard nothing but silence, for the birds could not follow him where there was nothing for them to eat. And eventually he came to more trees and walked for 10 minutes through them, and came out on a hill with a castle perched high on top. And he looked at the castle, and saw that every bird that should have been in the forest that now once no longer was, every one of those birds was perched on the turrets of the castle. Curious, Seamus climbed to the hill and rapped on the castle gates. He was admitted at once. Seamus asked the watchman at the gates, "Why are there so many birds clamouring on your turrets? What is going on?" "Nobody knows," said the watchman. "They appeared gradually several weeks ago, and now it is as if they are screaming and yelling for help. The king has asked somebody to tell him what the birds want and how to make them go away. He has promised a chest full of gold to anyone who can solve this problem for him. But if anybody should claim to solve the problem and there fail, he will have an eagle peck out their eyes." Well, Seamus laughed at that, for he knew he was at no danger whatsoever from eagles or any other birds. He looked at the watchman. He said, "Take me now to your king, for I can solve this mystery for him and make these birds go away." And the watchman sighed, for he knew many people had tried and many people had failed. But even so, he took Seamus through the castle to the king's chambers. And as Seamus went through the castle, he could hear the birds up in the turrets screaming for help. "Our home has gone," they screamed. "Our home is no more. We have nowhere to live. Help us." But that's why the birds were there. They were clamouring at the humans to save them from the devastation below in the forests. And so Seamus came before the king of that land, and he bowed deeply. And he said to the king, "I know why the birds are here. The birds are here because they have no option. What you have left of your forest that you can see is but a thin strip. If you send men through that strip, you will see that beyond it, all your forest has been devastated, and that thieves are chopping it down and are sailing the logs down the river to market. You must get rid of these thieves. You must you must make the forest protected, and then I can get the birds to disappear." Well, the king sent out messengers to see if this was true, and they came back within the hour, ashen-faced, to report that everything the stranger said was true, that there were loggers chopping down the forest, although it belonged to the king and to the people. Well, the king was horrified. "You must take people out there and punish these loggers," he said. "We must get rid of these thieves, and we must restore the trees to the birds. Then they'll leave us." Seamus nodded, for he knew it was true. And while the king sent out men to deal with the thieves, Seamus walked into the courtyard and gathered all the birds to him. "You must leave this place," he said. Fly west until you come to forest that still remains. Find a place there to build your nests and live there until the forest grows back, but then return, for it is important that the forest, when it regrows, has birds to live within it again." And the birds spoke in return all the wisdom they had learned from the sadness they had experienced, and they flew off. Well, the king was so relieved that he gave Seamus a chest full of gold, just as he had promised. "You may stay here if you wish," said the king. "You may stay here and make your home in our lands." But Seamus shook his head. "I don't know when I can go home," he said. "I don't know when I can be restored to my father's favour. But until then, I must wander the world alone." And he took the chest full of gold and the horse that the king gave him, and set again upon his way, again surrounded by birds that thanked him for solving their problem, and that taught him all the wisdom he should know. And one day there was an eagle came and that alighted beside him on a rock, and the eagle told him of what was happening back in Scotland. "Your father may have been powerful," it said, "but he was not wise. And although he gained land for himself, and although he fought off his enemies, all over his land people live on the verge of starvation. People live with meagre foods to eat, heavy taxes to pay, and with no hope of a future that will ever be brighter." "This is the world my father created with his strength?" asked Seamus. And the eagle nodded. So Seamus sent out more birds, all over Scotland and England, and all over the world, and they reported back sad stories that he had to hear. One came from a land where people were enslaved, and where slavers made their lives a misery. And one came from a land where there was constant war, and had been for generations. And another eagle flew again from Scotland, and reported tales of people who were so bent under the pressures of the taxes that his father had imposed that they could not survive. And Seamus went from land to land, and did what he could with the wisdom he was gaining. He went to lands where people were enslaved, and he whispered to them the secrets of their enslavers, and he whispered to them the strengths of the birds, the wisdom they gave him. And the enslaved rose up against those who enslaved them, and they bought their freedom with the visions that he gave them. And then he moved to land where there was constant war, and he had his birds go to both enemy camps and to listen to the arguments of each of the kings and queens, and then report back. And when Seamus had the wisdom of both sides, he moved himself between the enemy camps and shared with each of the kings the perspective of the other, until they had the wisdom to know that there was really nothing worth fighting for, and that there was no such thing as good and evil, and only two sides to a story. And when they had this information, the great kings and queens met across not battlefields, but peace conferences, and across the table peace accords were drawn up for their lands. And so Seamus moved through the world, becoming wiser, and with the money that people gave him for the happiness he left behind, he bought a ship, and so he sailed still further. But still the eagles came to him to report what was going on in the land of his birth, to tell him about people stuck in poverty, and to tell him about how war had ravaged the lands that his father had seen only as strong, until the day came when Seamus, now rich beyond anyone he knew, felt it was time to go home. "I must risk my father's wrath," he said, "for Scotland needs me now." And so he boarded his ship and sailed in all his finery to the home he had left as little more than a beggar. Well, many years had gone by at this time, and the king was indeed elderly. He was elderly and sick, with very little strength left to rule over the lands he had conquered. And his wife served him day after day and tried to keep him from death's door. And regret had grown in the heart of the chieftain. His one regret, that he had not banished his son the way he had, that he had not made it necessary for his son to flee for his life. "I know my son was weak," he said to his wife, "and therefore he is probably long dead." His wife said, "I think you might find Seamus would surprise you, for he may not have been strong, but he was other things." And the chieftain just looked at his wife and tried to make sense of her words. Well, one day word came to the chieftain that a great ship had anchored in the harbour below his castle, a ship carrying wealth beyond compare, with a lord aboard it who was wearing rich clothing and who was served by many people. And the chieftain awoke a little from his sad reverie. "Here is somebody great," he said. "I must greet him as somebody great and give him all the honours that a guest deserves. Invite him to a banquet in my hall tonight." And messengers were sent to the ship, and Seamus readied himself, but he put on a royal-looking cloak, and he covered his head with the cloak so that no one would see or recognise him. And he climbed up from his ship to the castle that had been his home his entire childhood, and he was welcomed as an honoured guest, and he entered the banqueting hall where he had heard the birds whisper to him in the chimney so many years before, and there the chieftain awaited him. "Welcome, great stranger," the chieftain said. "Please take the seat of honor in my banqueting hall." And he stepped aside so that Seamus might sit himself on the throne. And Seamus did so. And then, as was traditional for an honored guest, the chieftain picked up a flagon of ale and began to serve the stranger. And it was only when the stranger had been served his dinner too by the old man, the old chieftain, that Seamus lifted back the hood of his cloak. And his father and his mother gasped in surprise to see who this stranger dressed in riches really was, that it was their son who had left so many years before. "What the ravens spoke that day has come to pass, father," said Seamus. "I have now been served by you, sitting in your seat. But it was not because I usurped you. It was because I came to you as a stranger who you must honor." And the chieftain looked at him in surprise and said, But how did you survive? You had no strength. All you had was the ability to talk to birds." "I had nothing back then," Seamus said. "And what I have now has taken many years to grow. That old woman that my mother spoke to gave me not strength, she gave me the one thing that I needed more than anything else. She gave me a tool by which I might develop wisdom. And I come to you now, many years later, having suffered and grown, and to hope that I am not strong, but wise." And Seamus, over the next few days, spent valuable time with his father and realized that his father was ailing. And gradually his father slipped into his bed and died a happy death to know that his son had returned and that he would rule in his own way once he was gone. But Seamus did not rule alone, for he recognized the wisdom of his mother, who had given him what he had by speaking to the witch in the forest all those years ago. So it was Seamus and his mother who ruled the kingdom once the chieftain was gone. And Seamus used everything in his power to right the wrongs his father had created, and to replace a kingdom ruled by strength by a kingdom ruled by wisdom. He lowered the taxes, he gave alms to the poor, and he made it possible for everyone to have a living so that everyone could grow in prosperity. And he would build a world where everyone benefited from his father's spoils. And as time went on, a great castle was built by Seamus, the Castle Eilean Donan. And this tale is still told about that castle's origin, and about a chieftain who was so strong he could conquer everything, but could not conquer the one thing that his son learned to conquer, and that was the ability to be wise. That was the story of the boy who spoke to birds. Thank you for listening. Have a good night, and I'll see you tomorrow.